The following program is presented to you by the Hope Channel Network.
God, have you ever tried to communicate with Him and just felt like you weren't connecting? Well, today we've got some keys to share with you that are really entitled Radical Prayer. Stay with us here on Between the Lines. Welcome to another exciting program of Between the Lines. As we venture into communication with God, it moves into an area that becomes very personal and very direct because we are all trying to find a way to communicate with God in a way that will be meaningful and effective. You can't make God do what you want Him to do, but certainly there must be some tools that we can connect with. Today we're going to address that subject. The author of the book, Radical Prayer, is with us today, Dr. Derek Morris, who also pastors a large congregation in Orlando, Florida, and he's going to be sharing with us. Heather, I'm excited about this because prayer is a part of our lives and we want them to be more effective.
That's true, and it's easy for our prayer life to become weak, and there's so many prayers in the Bible, but Derek Morris has introduced us to one prayer that he's saying will change your life and amaze you with the results.
Well,
one radical prayer.
Dr. Morris has got the answer. Let's find out what it's all about.
Well, thank you. It's really your understanding of God wanting us to open our lives to Him in a way that will change everything is what this prayer is all about. This is actually a specific prayer, as Heather mentioned. Jesus in Luke chapter 10 really appeals to the 70 that He's sending out. And He says to them, because the harvest is great, but the laboring laborers are few, there's a specific prayer that I want you to pray. And that prayer is so radical that the translators in the English language really don't tell us what Jesus said. It's startling. I've wondered why they must know what the text says, but they water it down and just say, pray the Lord to send out laborers into His harvest. And I think we've been praying weak prayers too long. This is a very radical prayer that Jesus wants us to pray.
What is the text really saying? I mean, if that's not what it's saying, what is it really getting at that you have found in your research?
You know, that's a good question, Samuel. And it was about 10 years ago, I was reading through this passage in the original language, and I was startled by what I found. And I talked to a couple of New Testament scholars, and I said, have you ever seen this? Because I don't consider myself to be a linguist, but it was obvious to me that the English translation was not being fair. Unfortunately, many other translations, I've talked to people who speak Spanish and other parts of the world, and many of the translations that they have are translated from the English version. And so they carry this weakness with them. Before you even know what the prayer is, you get some clues that Jesus is very intentional and that this is something that could change everything. Jesus says, because the harvest, that is men and women, boys and girls, just waiting to be invited to be a part of His kingdom, because that harvest is great, but the laborers have become distracted because He calls everyone to be a laborer, but the laborers are few. He says, therefore pray. And before we even know the prayer, He uses a very strong verb. The verb literally means to beg, to earnestly cry out, to plead. So pray, you know, that can mean make a request, you know, like thank you for the world so sweet, thank you for the food we eat. But this verb, deomai in the Greek, means to beg. And I tell people, if you want to study the Bible, get a Young's Concordance and look up pray and find the verb deomai, and you find some remarkable stories, even in Luke's account of the gospel record. For example, in Luke 5, where a leper comes to Jesus, and it says he fell on his face and begged Him. The verb is deomai. So you go, wow, that's a strong prayer. Or in Luke chapter 8, where the man who's been delivered from legion of demons. It says he begged Jesus that he could go with him. The verb is deomai. Or a father whose son is controlled by a demon and says, I asked your disciples to help and they couldn't, but I beg you, speaking to Jesus. So these are all examples of that same verb. Even before we learn the prayer, we say, this is strong.
It's a passionate prayer.
Yeah, so really what you're saying is, as you adequately define that for us, you're really walking us through what Jesus' conviction was about this.
Right.
Because those who needed Jesus, who were begging, were in dire straits,
right.
desperate situations. They needed a healing that was, that was life-changing right then, right now.
So I don't want you to pray a weak prayer. Before I even tell you what the prayer is, I want you to cry out. I want you to beg. You say, wait a minute, why do we have to beg God? I thought God wanted laborers. But what God is going to do when we pray this prayer is so radical. He needs our permission. It's our heart that needs to change, not his heart. So right there, before we've even gone any further in Luke 10 and verse 2, we go, whoa, this is intense. A second clue that this is a very radical prayer is the way that Jesus tells us to pray. It's an imperative in the Greek, which is like a command or an earnest appeal. And there are two imperatives in the Greek language. A present imperative, which means keep on doing what you're doing. For example, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find. In other words, keep on doing what you're doing, keep on knocking. And then there's an aorist imperative, which means start doing something you're not yet doing. For example, when Lazarus is raised from the dead, Jesus says, loose him. Start doing, it's an imperative, but it's an aorist imperative. It means you're not yet doing what you need to do. Loose him. Well, in this text, it's an aorist imperative, which means I want you to begin to cry out like you've not been doing in the past. I want you, in common English, to pray like you've never prayed before.
Right. So Jesus is setting it up to be an important prayer. But
Absolutely.
What is it about this prayer that changes everything?
Well, then he goes on. He says, because the harvest is great, but the laboring laborers are few, I want you to begin to pray like you've never prayed before to the Lord of the harvest, because it's his harvest, it's not our harvest. I want you to pray that he would, and then comes the weak English translation, send out laborers. And that's not what the text says. In the Greek, to send out is the verb apostello, the noun apostolos. We get the English word apostle. It means one sent out. So I'm reading in my Greek text expecting to see apostello. It's in Luke 10 verse 1. It's throughout the Gospels for sending out. But that word isn't found. And I'm looking at a different Greek word and thinking, why is this here? And why are the translators not telling us what Jesus really asked us to pray?
Well, before you give us that definition, we're going to go to a break. And when we come back, we want you to tell us rather, exactly what that means, because we all want to know, because we want to be a part of this radical prayer. And I know that you want to stay with us. Join us again after we take this break in just a few moments.
For more information about any of the books presented today on Between the Lines, visit your local Adventist Book Center or go online at www.adventistbookcenter.com. If you are interested in receiving a copy of today's book and live in the United States and Canada, call 1-800-765-6955. That's 1-800-765-6955.